without further ado, it's my great privilege today to introduce our next keynote speaker. Steve Roberts is a Professor of Education and Social Justice and Head of School of Education and Culture and Society in Monash University. And Steve is extensively published and well-renowned internationally as a sociologist and an expert in two main areas of research: the changes and continuities in boys' and men's masculinity practices and inequalities in young people's transitions into adulthood. Among other things, Steve is also an associate editor of the Journal of Youth Studies. So some of you here will know Steve personally, and I'm sure many of you will know his work. Not only that, but he's travelled all the way from Australia to join us here in Belfast, and we're very grateful for that as well, Steve. Steve, I believe today that your address is going to be in relation to your wide body of work in relation to working class boys and men, and I'm certainly really looking forward to be hearing what you have to say, and I'm sure that extends to the rest of the audience as well. So, without further ado, please welcome Professor Steve Roberts.
Thanks, Gail. Thanks, Susan and Gail and all the organisers for the conference so far. And thanks to Rob, Tracy and Dan especially for inviting me and proving once again that it's who you know rather than what you know that gets you these cool gigs to do something fun. It's a privilege, of course, huge privilege to be given an extended time to talk about stuff that matters to me, but especially at this conference. And I was taken by what Dan said yesterday about... Oh, is this mic not working? Hello? Bring this one closer. I've got one here as well. Oh, it's just a recording. I'm flashing right at the chest. I don't know if you noticed, I don't have an electronic heart, but I do have something happening here. Okay, let me wait a bit closer. Maybe I'm too tall for this low desk. Hopefully, can you hear me now at the back? Right, okay. So, yeah, I wanted to say, Dan, when Dan was saying yesterday, there's something special about getting this community back together, and I think it especially holds true for the friends and colleagues that we have here, many of whom, for me, I'm meeting again for the first time in nearly a decade in person, which feels kind of strange, and many more, actually, that I'm meeting for the first time in person, and I'm sure many of us had that weird feeling yesterday where we bump into people and we're like, I know this person, and it turns out that we have been chatting on social media for the last 10 years, but I've never actually met in person, and now we see them with all of their dimensions, and we're wondering, how are they that tall, and so on. People keep saying that I'm taller than I look on my photos, so there's that. Okay, a caveat in advance, just for fun, and probably because a combination of severe jet lag yesterday and very super strong muscle relaxants that I take for a terrible condition, which I've only just been taking for a week, and they make me slightly drunk. And the people that were at the pub last night might have noticed that I was talking nonstop, and apologies for that. But anyway, that combination of things also produced this moment of inspiration for me where I asked ChatGPT to generate images for the content that I'm going to talk to. So I kind of want to say any credit or any complaint for the images that follow can go directly to OpenAI. It's not my fault. So yeah, the issue I'm going to talk about is one that's really important to me, part of my work over a long period of time. And it's this problem with working class boys and young men. And my basic pitch is that the academy it's the academy's problem. It's not just a problem. And well, it's part of the academy, so not everyone. It's a kind of blunt treatment of working class boys and men. And I've been grappling with this in my writing for 8 or 10 years probably. And I still write about it now because it's still present, like it's still present in academic writing. It's present in a whole variety of comments and engagements I get through the peer review process and from academics. Is someone whistling? You're booing me off the stage already. Yeah, it's present in engagements through peer review, from questions and comments at conferences. And interestingly, just last week, I was talking to one of the world's leading scholars of gendered violence, and she made this comment about how she couldn't comprehend what had happened to that family, this middle-class family whose boy had killed his woman partner. And what was striking, obviously, it's a terrible, terrible incident, and the incidence of murders of women in Australia this year is shocking high. It's disgusting. But what was striking to me in that conversation, there was an implicit class commentary there, because she never said the same thing about the poor boys who killed their partners. It was kind of interesting. So the problem is basically this. There's this instinct that when it comes to gender relations, working class boys and men are the worst. Working class masculinity is the worst. And on some level, for the people that think this, feel it, say it, it makes sense because working class conditions of existence are hard and they probably produce the worst kind of people. And I want to evidence that thinking as it occurs in the masculinity scholarship especially. But I think also in engaging with it, it helps to ensure that the main architects and beneficiaries of patriarchy are kept in view. So yeah, my critique is kind of more squarely aimed at masculinity studies, but I hope there's an opportunity here for us all to reflect on, and to borrow the phrase from the conference, to stop the clock and think about how we write about, how we practically engage with working class boys and young men. So, there we go. Caveat. Not all academics, of course. I'm not going to criticize everyone. Some people are very, very sensitive about this, and they think, no, that's definitely not me. So I wanted to say that, and I believe this, that youth studies has a more natural disinclination to the kind of negative depiction that I'm going to engage with today. And the kind of critical youth studies scholarship that comes through our journal is built on an understanding of youth as a site of inequality and understandings that young people are very often at the wrong end of power, systems of power. So we all often seek to disrupt stereotypes, and we seek to understand impacts of these compounding systems of inequality, such as race, class, and gender, and sexuality, and disability, and so on. And we challenge the way that the marginalized are depicted by our media and spoken about by our politicians. And we're also interested in empowerment and agency and highlighting how young people navigate and resist negative circumstances. That said, again, I hope there's something interesting and a moment to reflect for all of us. So I want to start with casting our minds back to the 1970s and how the pioneering texts of the day dealt with working class young men. So one way to consider many of the works in the CCCS collection that was published as Resistance Through Rituals, and of course, perhaps more obviously, Paul Willis's classic text, Learning to Labour, one way of treating these is to say that they treated working class young men and working class culture with sympathy and respect. But another way of thinking about it has been to say that these studies actually lionized and celebrated working class culture too much. And thanks to critique by especially Angela McRobbie, we saw that many of those studies left gender power dynamics on the margins or left girls out of the equation altogether. So putting aside whether or not Willis lionized his lads, what did happen, I think, is that these detailed discussions that he offered us in his book, these 12 lads from the Black Country, they became the stand-in, the template for working class life, and the stand-in for knowledge about working class masculinity as a whole for decades to come. Into the 1980s, we have broader depictions of working class engagement with school especially. So through texts like Richard Jenkins' Belfast-based study, Lads, Citizens and Ordinary Kids, and Phil Brown's Schooling Ordinary Kids, and then Martin Mackingale's work at the beginning of the 90s, all of these presented typologies that disrupt the idea that working class boys and working class masculinity is monolithic. And the concern with the narrowness of Willis's sample actually still plays out today. So very recently, Jeff Wolford, a few months ago in the pages of the journal Ethnography and Education, he described how in Willis's book, the move from the particular culture of these 12 lads to the much more general working class culture is made continually within the book, when all that can be claimed realistically is that this particular cultural form is one of the many possibilities many possible working class cultural forms that can be generated. And I think what Greg is saying here is important, even though it's many decades after the fact. These are some of those images that I talked about. Enjoy, especially those handsome guys on the left. So despite the efforts at nuancing depictions of working class boys and men from Jenkins and Brown in the 80s and then through the last 10 years, so especially Nicola Ingram's work on working class boys' educational success, Anna Tarrant's work on fatherhood in the context of poverty, some of my own work with Carla Elliott on working class men's capacity for care, and more recently, really interesting new generation of scholars whose PhDs and subsequent publications, so I'm thinking here of people like Richard Gator, Alex Blower, and Isaac Hoff, who are all at the conference and doing great things. Despite this kind of nuancing, I want to suggest that the prevailing image of working class masculinity in large parts of the academic imagination still associates working class men first and foremost with what, again, Nicola Ingram describes as the triumvirate of masculine ills. So this is being avowedly anti-feminine, homophobic, and misogynistic. And I think probably the image on the right kind of captures that more than the one on the left. So it's not that many scholars don't appreciate that working class young men are disenfranchised in contemporary neoliberal economies, or that they are negatively affected by societal expectations of masculinity. But even with this recognition, what I think we see in masculinity studies is there's this irregular binding together of the worst excesses of orthodox masculinity and working class identity. The kind of two are the same thing. And it ultimately means that I think there's a pathologizing of this very group who are relatively oppressed. So thinking about critical studies of men and masculinities then, like this area of work is of course first and foremostly interested in gender inequalities, and it manifests first and justly as a concern about the gender order as a system of oppression and the enactment and legitimation of men's dominance over women and gender diverse people. But it's also concerned with power relations between and among men. And so for decades, as we probably all know in this room, and I'll go through this really quickly because I don't want to teach you to suck eggs about masculinity theory, but masculinity, we talk about it in the plural. And attention is given to this hierarchy of masculinities that's most famously associated with Raewyn Connell's work on hegemonic masculinity. So hegemonic masculinity, very briefly, taken to mean a culturally esteemed but historically mobile configuration of practice that sits atop of a relational dominance hierarchy, above a variety of other masculinities, but also above and in relation to femininities, and in doing so legitimates gender inequality. And in later work with Messerschmitt, Connell develops this idea that there was hegemony is a plural as well. It can look different locally, regionally, and globally. So I assume most people will know this, but just in case people don't, I'll quickly talk about these other types of masculinities that Connell conceptualizes. So she talks about complicit masculinities that characterize the gender practice of the majority of men who passively support the hegemonic structures and who benefit from the patriarchal dividend. She then talks about subordinated masculinity, which is most commonly associated with gay masculinities, derived from the idea that heterosexuality and homophobia are the bedrock of hegemonic masculinity. And then finally, marginalized masculinities. She talks about these as emerging from the interplay between gender and class and race and disability. And as such, these are defined in relation to a kind of relative cultural and economic powerlessness. And there's been lots of critiques of this concept, and in a way, it doesn't matter too much because I'm not hanging much on the concept as I walk through this. But very briefly, Christensen and Jensen usefully summarize this critiques. They talk about it. Hegemonic masculinity as being situated as being too structural, too abstract, for reifying normative masculinity positions, for a lack of conceptual cogency, and that this has resulted in contradictory approaches to and uses of the concept. There's a bunch of other critiques as well, talking about how it can't necessarily capture positive changes of masculinity. I think the best, deepest work on this is Richard Howson's work that talks about, perhaps controversially, about how Connell almost betrays the Gramscian origins of the concept because it's unable to provide an idea of positive hegemony, although I'll challenge that as I walk through. Feminist post-structuralists also have critiqued the concept for its fixedness and talked about how masculine typologies actually invisibilize the role of agency in producing or resisting harmful masculine norms. So despite these engagements, it remains an incredibly well-cited concept, and the reason I'm talking about it is because what follows my discussion, lots of the texts that I'm going to talk about hang their hat on this kind of framework. So I want to suggest, again, in large part, that scholarly depictions of working class boys and men and of marginalized masculinities are pretty static, they're pretty one-dimensional, and they're quite negative on the whole. And I want to be really careful here because it's not a criticism of the very, very necessary attention to gendered power relations among marginalized men and boys, who are, of course, sometimes both oppressors and the oppressed. The criticism is instead at the way middle-class academic knowledge can locate an oppressed group as overall being the most likely bearers of harm. And I think that's a problem, and I think it's scapegoating, and again, I think it removes focus from who are the main beneficiaries and actors in patriarchy. So one very common trope in the masculinities literature is that working class boys and men's violence, sexism, and homophobia stems from powerlessness. And if we want to see where this plays out in the text, it's been around for decades, but James Messerschmitt, a key figure in the field, makes this point very regularly. So in 1993, for example, he suggests that without a steady, reliable job or the probability of obtaining one, or other traditional indicators of successful masculinity, then violent behavior may establish itself as a legitimate route to powerful manhood. And then in 2000, again, he talks about how men experiencing powerlessness in the labor market, sometimes these men choose marital rape as a suitable resource for asserting themselves as so-called real men. And it's plausible, right? It's a plausible explanation. But my problem with it is that it does little to explain, and they don't try to explain why others in the same circumstances, in the same material conditions, don't necessarily resort to those tactics. But moreover, it does not really try and grapple with the fact that men with social power, men with social recognition and entitlement do the same kinds of acts. So this is important because actually there's not a lot of evidence that perpetrators of sexual assault, for example, come from one social class or another, even though we know that working class women, black women, indigenous women are all more likely to be perpetrated against. It's possible, of course, that middle class men's entitlement and working class men's lack of power are drivers of the same sorts of behavior. But what I'm trying to draw attention to is that working class boys and working class men's lack of power is the dominant narrative in this type of research. And there are lots of examples of this, and I'm going to walk through some of them now. So a well-cited piece by Costin and Kimmel in 2012 suggests that working class men are emasculated by their managers in the workplace, but also by this is their word, their societal positioning as dumb. And consequently, such boys and men are said to attempt to recuperate a sense of status in their relationship with other working class people by exercising power over them and seeing, basically because they can't do that with middle class people. So these authors go on to outrightly state that for working class men, sexism and patriarchy are key features of their masculine dominance, and there is a type of white male working class solidarity vis-a-vis privilege that these men have constructed and maintained that promotes and perpetuates racism, sexism, and homophobia. Again, possibly true, but is it so widespread and is it everything? I don't know. They also argue that in the absence of legitimated hierarchical benefits and status, working class husbands and partners, they say this with no data, are more likely to produce hypermasculinity by relying on blatant, brutal, and relentless power strategies in their marriages, including spousal abuse. So, again, I'm not saying that this is not a feature of working class life, of working class men's practices, but the heterogeneity of working class life gets lost in this dominant and homogenous picture of working class masculinity. I'm not picking and choosing here. There is so much literature that talks about this. So another telling contribution is Peter Jansen's summation here. He says, in a society that offers low possibilities for men doing masculinity with conventional means and where men have low access to economic, social, and cultural resources, violence against women presents one of the few ways for men to reinforce their masculinity. Thinking about violence more broadly, Hochstetler and colleagues, they did a study of bar fights, very interesting study, but it also draws on similar notions of working class men's violence. So they argue that specific elements of fighting events represent symbolic attempts at attaining and maintaining honor and status, which many men in working class culture equate with masculine identity. And I guess what I wanted to say here is that what's curiously absent is that there is no mention, hardly any mention in the literature, but definitely not in this paper, of honor and status also being valued aspects of masculinity across the class spectrum. And so, as with many other scholars, this position is kind of underpinned by this assumption that, and they quote, pursuit of symbolic masculinity is important to working class men who possess fewer alternative avenues for achieving status than those from higher social ranks. And there is a long list of others that do this, and just a selection here. So, and they all point to the way that these studies at the bottom talk about how working class men and men of color resort to antisocial, aggressive, and violent means to assert masculinity in the absence of social power. So again, what becomes clear in this thinking is that the main course of action available to men in the margin in terms of their masculinity is to grasp power through violence, through homophobia and misogyny. And seemingly the kind of flip side of that is that maybe privileged boys and men do not need to engage in such regressive tactics because they already hold privilege and power. This has consequences for how we imagine the possibilities for positive social change in gender relations at the individual level and at the cultural level. And this is one of those interesting images that the AI generated again when I asked it to talk about masculinity and positive social change. It seems to have done J.D. Vance in the middle, which is shocking. But what I really wanted to get at here is that at the point of talking about positive social change is important because, I think it's important anyway, but even more important that Connell herself says this, but often it's described as the opposite. People usually think that Connell doesn't talk about positive social change, but she actually calls for this kind of research on numerous occasions. So for example, in The Men and the Boys, which is nearly 25 years old now, she states that investigating the circumstances where gender patterns are less or more open to change seems an important task for research. In 2022, it's kind of like a blog post, but it's an academic blog post on for a blog/journal called Global Dialogue. She talks about the need to theorize more egalitarian forms of masculinity, which we may hope prefigure ways for men to live in an equal gender equal society. And then even her colleague, James Messerschmidt, and I say even because this was quite a big pivot for Messerschmidt, I think, he has started saying things like the conceptualization of hegemonic masculinity should acknowledge explicitly the possibility of democratizing gender relations and of abolishing power differentials, and talks eventually about needing to talk about masculinities that are positive. But in the same book where he says that, he then demolishes a whole bunch of research that tries to do that. So I'm working with this idea of like betterism, where some scholars think they are better, they could do it, but working class people definitely can't do it. Okay, so the mainstream literature is generally, and I think healthily, skeptical of and critical of suggestions of positive change. Like they don't take it as a given. Positive change in men's gender practices I'm talking about here. But what's interesting is that it's really unambiguous about who has sufficient scope to move in the direction of democratic gender relations. So middle class or otherwise privileged men and boys are basically positioned as having this flexibility in their identity, or flexibility for identity, that situates them as more likely to be able to be progressive. And here's a selection, again, there's lots of this stuff, but here's a selection of statements that make that point. So Wolfman and colleagues, they write that non-hegemonic positions are often more readily available to relatively more privileged men. Andrea Cristofido in Norma in a paper in 2021 makes a similar point, stating that, for example, the repertoire of valued manifestations and understandings of masculinity may be widening, very crucial, but mostly among certain groups of privileged men, which comprises insufficient evidence to support that systems of gender and sexual equality have been erased or even transformed. In the context of nursing and men's development of more emotional repertoires, Marcy Cottingham also ponders whether redefinitions of masculinity towards a more sensitive ideal might come from those privileged by other social characteristics such as race, socioeconomic status, and sexuality. Sarah Hunter and colleagues, again, starting from this healthy, I think, cynical standpoint, thinking about fatherhood and the new fatherhood, they say new and involved fatherhood is very much associated with white, middle to upper class fathers, and that such fathers, this is the crucial part again, possess the economic, social, and cultural resources to be able to take risks with their identities. And then Sam Du Bois critiquing as others have done, the heavy optimism in Eric Anderson's work on inclusive masculinity. He says that what Eric is finding may only be describing the behavior of sexually liberal, complicit and middle classes. And again, ponders on the usefulness of this, given that, quote, middle class men historically have not necessarily been considered the most chauvinistic, homophobic or physically powerful. Good for them. So the middle class masculinity offers greater scope for reflexivity, has become this kind of normative dominant understanding, ingrained almost at the level of common sense for many scholars. And I would suggest actually for many of us as well. So on this point, I just want to quickly detour and talk about some research that I've done with my colleague Stephanie Westcott at Monash. And in this study, we interviewed women teachers about their experiences of boys' behavior in the context of the growing popularity of the manosphere, and especially the influence of the notorious content producer Andrew Tate, who I'm sure we've all heard of. So we put out a call for participants on social media, and we were overwhelmed. You know how usually it takes months and months and months to get your sample? We had 100 women teachers apply to take part in this study within weeks. And in the first phase, we did 30 interviews with a complete cross-section of women teachers from private schools, from public schools, from Catholic independent schools. And it's probably worth noting, actually, that in Australia, state schools make up only about 65% of schools. So, yeah, the sample was secondary teachers, a few primary teachers. There was a preponderance towards humanities teachers, but there was quite a lot of variability. And the most striking thing about the findings, the narratives in the interviews of these women, was that they were uniform. Some of the examples were different, but the themes were the same across the context. So what we heard was that Andrew Tate is his sayings, his ideas, his ways of being, they've infiltrated the classroom. There was what we describe in our research papers on this, a resurgent sense of masculine supremacy. And that's because teachers reported that they had noticed a change in boys' behavior. They, more than anyone, know that sexism has been a long-standing feature of schooling in Australia, but they're also super aware that post the return to class, after very extensive lockdowns for COVID reasons in Australia, so after remote schooling, they were more likely to, they felt that they were more likely to observe and be on the receiving end of comments about their makeup, about their breasts, about their period, about their and be exposed to the presence of sexualized groaning. the presence of comments that Andrew Tate says stuff like, girls don't need to concentrate in school because they can get an OnlyFans account if they need money. All of this is delivered in the minds of the teachers with a new brazenness and entitlement by a significant minority of boys to the detriment of girls' learning and participation in school. The teachers also told us that they observe this kind of stated admiration for Tate's emphasis on kind of neoliberal manhood and exorbitant wealth. And this is part of a model of masculinity that they find appealing. And as part of that as well, teachers find themselves challenging boys' adoption of Tate's ideology around the idea that men need to reclaim their diminished social position. Again, almost near uniformly, but kind of more overt in terms of reputation management techniques in elite schools, we heard stories of inadequate responses from school leadership and male colleagues when women complained about this stuff. They are met with, we'll be familiar with this, it has an intuitive kind of understanding, but what they're told is boys will be boys, maybe you're not good enough at managing behavior, it might not be as bad as you're saying. And Steph and I have written a paper that will be coming out in British Journal of Sociology of Education in the next few months, where we describe this and theorize it as a pattern of institutional gaslighting. Two women in the sample left teaching altogether because of the behavior. And more commonly, the teachers we talk to are frazzled and depressed. Their place of work is not healthy for them. It is not safe. This research, even though the media keeps saying, well, it's only 30 women, it got a lot of media coverage. And as a result of that, we receive emails every single week this year from teachers telling us similar stories. And what's interesting is that the media, but also in conference papers too, they still resort to that same question. Despite the things I just told you, they say, you're talking about the boys in schools in lower socioeconomic areas, right? And actually an academic colleague observed some of our findings that we described on Twitter, and they criticized us, and they said, I think you're probably talking about Arab boys from low socioeconomic status backgrounds, and you are being unfair. Right, but of course, and moreover, the teachers were not talking about Arab boys per se. Like, of course, there were some Arab boys at some schools, but the boys being discussed were at this range of schools. They were a range of boys up and down the spectrum. What's all the more striking is that the expectation that amplified sexism and misogyny might more likely occur at schools in poorer areas comes despite this kind of unbearable and unbelievable headline of so much, like unbelievable frequency in Australia. So we get regular stories of boys at elite schools behaving disgustingly. This includes this year a derogatory ranking and rating list of girl students, including who is unrapeable at Yarra Valley Grammar School and Pembroke Grammar School, a sexualized deepfake scandal at Bacchus Marsh Grammar School, and then Peninsula Grammar School just a few weeks ago, a porn hack prank where boys set up a computer to show porn to the wellbeing advisor, and she obviously didn't give any consent, and it was just kind of presented to her, and they videoed her and then posted it online to show her reaction. Going back a few years as well, the case of St. Kevin's schoolboys is quite interesting. They were filmed doing a misogynistic chant loudly and proudly on a public tram in Melbourne City. That video has 150 million views on TikTok. And yet, we get this prevailing negative stereotype. And I think that stereotype, I want to argue, is representative of an issue of epistemic injustice, because the dominant portrayals of men in the margin do not allow for the capacity of such folks to be legitimate knowers of their own social reality. And again, it's anecdotal, but it's real. On each and every occasion that me and my team publish anything that's remotely positive about working class men or somehow complicates working class adherence to traditional masculine ideals, there's always a resistance in peer review or question. Are you sure? Can we believe them? This is happening right now in a paper that we have got going through a process where it's about young men's ongoing employment in low-level, low-paid frontline care work in Australia. And some viewers are saying the same thing. They want to know why. Why doesn't the data demonstrate masculinity recuperation? Because I imagine that's what's going to happen. Boys who are working in feminine jobs, they're going to hate it. So please tell me that they hate it. Can interviewees present what they think the researcher could hear? Of course. People might say one thing and they might do another. But I think imposing our logic, imposing our prejudice over the top and begging for scholars to tell us the story of problematic masculinity is itself problematic. And I borrow from Anki Bankston here, who's talking about a totally different context. but she describes these kinds of situations as a wronging that occurs when a person's information, knowledge, or beliefs are not given the credibility they deserve because of negative prejudices towards the speaker. And so what I see in the responses, such as those I just described, is this social assumptions concerning the competence and sincerity of knowing and interpreting reality. There's a template for how to do this better, and will close fairly soon. In fact, there's more than one template for how to do this better. But I want to focus on the thinking, the generosity, and the sharp scholarly minds that form the key currents in Black social thought, and especially in writing on Black masculinity. Both overtly feminist and some kind of maybe pro-feminist, but don't necessarily say it. But what I'm suggesting here is that following the path of others in terms of learning, rather than just co-opting, learning from Black scholarship is really important. So my thinking here is informed by different people's kind of incorporation of Black social thought into different ideas. So I'm thinking here about Imogen Tyler's work, which revitalized the concept of stigma, which I'm sure many of us know. And she talks about how that she developed this in a dialogue with a rich but largely marginalized lineage of stigma thinking within the Black sociological tradition. And then also Alison Phipps is an excellent example of someone that draws upon scholars of color as the foundation for a critique of mainstream feminism and its tendency towards political whiteness. So yeah, what I'm saying is that Black social thought offers a foundation for less deficit-laden portrayals of men on the margins. And the people that think this way, the Black scholars that write this way, they're not in the business of denying that marginalized men can be and sometimes are violent. Sometimes they're homophobic, sometimes they're sexist. There's no denial of this kind of stuff. There's no denial of masculine privilege. As Alfred Young Jr. notes in his book, Are Black Men Doomed? That which such men have done to the detriment of themselves and others is so well documented in the media and other public avenues that neither denial or erasure could be a plausible objective. So Young's argument is that we need to try at least to unlearn what we think we know and be prepared to think anew. And I think this is relevant. Working class men and men of color, especially low-income men of color, they have in common that any consideration of them, again to quote Young, as having the capacity to be self-reflective or conscientious is suppressed by a pervasiveness of their character assassination. And so he goes on to talk about how we need to avoid collapsing back into simple indictments of these men as adherents to flawed or profligate value systems and normative orders, and instead encourages us to think about having an obligation to re-envisage such men as complex human beings, a mixture of socially defined positive and negative attributes, much like other people. Who would have thought working class people are just like other people, rather than wholly unworthy? So what I'm saying is applying these logics to working class men can cultivate a renewed and more nuanced picture of social reality of life at the lower end of the socioeconomic hierarchy. And I just want to kind of do some justice to the long lineage of scholarship that does this in Black social thought. So lots of Black critical scholars have troubled these kind of manifestly narrow depictions and persistent understandings of Black masculinity. Notably, Bell Hooks, who's perhaps one of the most famous Black critical feminists, has highlighted the significant diversity of Black men's lives in the US. So she talks about how, this was a long time ago she was saying this, in every segregated Black community in the US, there are adult Black men, married, unmarried, gay, straight, living in households where they do not assert patriarchal dominance and yet live fulfilled lives. And more than that, and against the grain of the broader critical masculinities literature, Hooks stresses how the use of power as a fact relevant to the lives of those is relevant to the lives of those far beyond the marginalized classes. She says, showing aggression is the simplest way to assert patriarchal manhood. Men of all classes know this. So why do we keep saying it's mostly working class men? And really importantly, and again, I think this is a difficult pill to swallow. I navigate challenges in writing about this. Hooks and other Black feminists highlight that while complex, solidarities between men and women from marginalized groups are often greater than any based primarily on gender that exists between middle-class white women and working-class Black women. So what Hooks is contending is that there is a special tie that binds people together when they struggle collectively for liberation. Black women and men have been united by such ties. Now, interestingly, I don't think we see in the masculinities literature any consideration of whether political solidarity can emerge, not even as an open question about whether this can emerge between working class men and working class women sharing shared struggles. Building on Hooks's work, there's a beautiful, beautiful book by Aronette White. It's vastly underappreciated, especially if citations are anything to go by. Her book is called Ain't I a Feminist? And it's an account of the lives of feminist identifying black men in the US. And she does such a beautiful job of holding academics to account, holding the media to account, challenging the dualistic depictions of black men as either endangered or the most dangerous. And she kind of critically unpacks these life narratives and shows that black men can, not always do, but can resist and negotiate patriarchal masculinity norms in relation to fatherhood, in relation to sexual and romantic relationships, and also friendships. And again, there's a whole list of literature here that I'm not going to talk about because I don't have time. Many of these scholars, in different ways, problematize depictions of black masculinity as a stagnant monolith. But of course, black masculinity scholarship is on the side. It's also marginalized, so we don't hear about it very often. And I think what's great about these accounts is that they help normalize alternative possibilities for manhood and masculinity. And at the conceptual and theoretical level, this kind of picture allows for a critical interrogation of the size of the role of relative powerlessness as being the main driver of socio-negativity. I've got 2 quick slides to go. So before I finish, I wanted to say that the actions of some working class men, including in this city, in many cities across the UK, inspired by middle class men, mind. I think that's one thing we should always bring to the front of our thinking. This kind of stuff made my blood run cold. I was deeply concerned and emotional at what I was seeing play out on TV, and honestly didn't think I'd come to Belfast 2 weeks ago. I was felt desperately unsafe, even though I was 12,000 miles away. Looking like I do and imagining being pulled out of a car and beaten up for the colour of my skin, as we were seeing that was happening in the northeast. This was terrifying. My family felt scared for me as well. But what I want to suggest is that maybe working class masculinity is the abhorrent racism, violence, and paternalistic claims to protection of women and girls that we see on the left-hand side. But maybe it's also the image on the right, where working class boys and men, and people of all genders, actually rallied round to show care and community to help rebuild the Southport Mosque. And maybe it's even much more than that really simplistic binary. So, in closing, I want to suggest that we can and should challenge the insistence that symbolic and material domination means that social actors are understandably unable to engage in productive and reflexive practices, and even that they'll often be bad faith actors, actually. There's another marginalized literature that's helpful here, and that's the broader kind of working class studies literature. It's full of stories of compassion, of communality and solidarity and different types of care. But it's missing in the kind of dominant discussions of working class masculinity in other literatures, in the mainstream literature, I would say. So in addition to the epistemic and other injustices at the heart of this narrative of working class deficit, I think continuing to mainly stick to this story, it robs us the possibility of hope. And there's a bit of naivety I appreciate here, but I do think hope is important. And again, I'm relying on scholars that have taught me the same. So Raymond Williams in 1980, talking about obviously very different forms of oppression, but still useful, I think. He said, to be truly radical is to make hope possible rather than despair convincing. And then back to bell hooks. In 1984, she more famously wrote, excuse me, hope is essential to any political struggle for radical change when the overall social climate promotes disillusionment and despair. And if we want to be kind of, if we think being hopeful is too risky, you could also look to the more measured words of Lynn Segal in her book Slow Motion in 1990, where she says, it is possible to steer a course between defeatist pessimism and fatuous optimism. So working class boys and men can be held to account, should be held to account. We should make sense of how they perpetuate and reproduce unequal gender relations, but they have to be allowed to be part of the story, to be the actors in making a hopeful and realistic future. And I think following the insights in black feminist thought, we might even suggest they have to be, not just that they could be. So I'll end with this question, stop the clock and ponder this. Carla Elliott and I posed this question in qualitative research a few years ago, and I think it's relevant to masculinity scholars, but also to youth studies scholars, youth studies practitioners as well. What counts as problematic masculinity, and who gets to decide? What values are we bringing with us when we attempt to judge what men in our research should or should not be doing or saying? That's it. Thank you.